Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring thoughtography, or the psychic photography, in particular the psychic photography of Ted Serios. With me is Dr. Stephen Braude, who is the author of Limits of Influence, and he's a specialist in psychokinesis, which is what we'll be talking about. His other books include The Gold Leaf Lady and Crimes of Reason. He is former chair of the philosophy department at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County, and he is also a past president of the Parapsychological Association. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to be here again.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I think when it comes to psychic photography, there are two things to keep in mind. One is that the field is associated with all sorts of fraud, and second of all, it goes back to the very early days of photography itself.
Yes, I think to explain what it's all about, we need first to distinguish between spirit photography and thoughtography. Mm-hmm. As far back as photography existed, occasionally extras would appear in photographs. Mm-hmm. Many people thought that these extras, these additional, sometimes hazy images of people, were ways in which spirits could communicate with the living. It was also a way in which fraudulent photos could be produced, darkroom techniques even at that time. Thoughtography is a little bit different. It doesn't purport to give evidence of survival of bodily death. Instead, it has to do with the apparent ability of people to impress images on unexposed film. Mm-hmm.
By concentrating.
Yes. Or even inadvertently. I mean, the earliest experiments were done in like 1910 by a Japanese researcher named Fukurai, and he found while studying a clairvoyant that images were appearing on photographic plates that he had. And that attracted a lot of attention at the time, also a lot of criticism, and eventually Fukurai dropped that research altogether. And
not that it was ever proven to be fraudulent.
No, quite the contrary. But he came in for a lot of criticism, as even people do today.
Well, the truth of the matter is we're talking about large-scale psychokinesis, and almost inevitably you're going to have a contingent of people who think that this is impossible and therefore it must be either fraud or delusion.
Yes, it's a standard skeptical reaction. It's been existing since the early days of spirit photography. And in those days, it has to be said, there was reason for skepticism. Mm-hmm. But Fukurai's experiments were very clever and are worth investigating by the curious. After Fukurai stopped, people in Europe and America continued to do some work along those lines, but eventually people lost interest in it, and part of the reason for that was it was all too easy to claim, justifiably or otherwise, that people were using some sort of darkroom tricks to produce anomalous photos. Mm-hmm. And that's why the case of Ted Serios is important.
And Ted Serios was a Chicago bellhop.
Correct.
He was researched primarily, as I recall, in the 1960s, 1970s, and mostly by a Denver psychiatrist, Dr. Jule Eisenbud.
Right. Serios had been experimenting with hypnosis, and he discovered while he was playing with hypnosis that he could make images appear on film, first on regular box cameras, and then on the newly invented Polaroid system of so-called instant photography. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons the case is important, because Serios' images were produced on the spot, and there could be no question that darkroom techniques were involved in the production of the photos. And Eisenbud conducted his research between 1964 and 1967, and that's when most of the good phenomena took place.
And I understand Serios, his abilities declined over time.
They ended pretty abruptly in June of 1967 when he produced an anomalous picture of curtains. And Eisenbud, being the psychiatrist, saw the symbolism immediately. Fini, the curtains had come down on the most productive phase of Serios' career.
But he continued to produce anomalous photographs. In fact, you worked with him many years later, as I recall.
Yes, that's true. The kinds of anomalous photographs that Serios produced at that time and had produced earlier were called blackies and whiteys. These are important because the blackies look like they were entirely or mostly underexposed. They were just black pictures. And the reason those were anomalous is that light had not been prevented from reaching the Polaroid lens. Whiteys were just the opposite. They looked like they were severely overexposed, but they occurred under conditions in which all light had been presumably prevented from reaching the film.
But the most interesting pictures are not blackies or whiteys. They're very detailed images.
Well, let's not demean the blackies and whiteys, because one of the reasons they're important is that it has to do with the way in which skeptics try to explain away Serios's productions altogether.
Yes.
And you're right that Serios also produced various kinds of anomalous images, sometimes ostensibly corresponding to target pictures which had been placed in opaque envelopes and Serios had never seen.
Yeah.
Sometimes they were just spontaneous productions of Serios.
But we should say Eisenbud worked with him extensively. Many, many dozens of people witnessed the phenomena.
Quite true, including several conjurers. So the controls were, I think, very, very solid, and all the people who witnessed the photographs would sign off on the back indicating that this exactly was the photograph that had been produced and so on. So Eisenbud has sworn affidavits from the various people who participated.
And he employed the most rigorous methodologies he was able to bring to bear.
Yes, I mean, he would use marked packs of film, marked cameras. Serios would sometimes not even touch the camera. Sometimes Serios was at a distance from the camera when the photographs were produced. Sometimes he was placed in a electrically shielded Faraday cage, separated from the camera, which was on the outside of the cage. Those were among the controls imposed.
And one of the unique things about Serios was that he tended to produce his pictures while inebriated.
Well, there are several reasons why the case is interesting and excellent fodder for skeptics. Serios was a hardcore alcoholic. He consumed enormous quantities of alcohol, and he preferred working in an inebriated state. But of course, as this went on and the evening drew on and he was drinking more and more, he became more difficult to manage. He was also something of a prima donna. And that worried a lot of skeptics who thought that he was just getting out of control and the distractions produced would make it very difficult to control him. Eisenbud and his colleagues they allowed Serios to think he was in control, but they were paying very close attention to what he did.
And over time, hundreds of these anomalous thougtographs were produced.
Thousands, really, but about 400 of images.
Yeah. And I might point out that you worked with Eisenbud in several respects. I think you became close to him personally.
Yes, we were very close friends.
And you arranged to have the collection of his photographs and writings and so on preserved at the University of Maryland Library.
Yes, the entire Eisenbud Serios material is in the special collections section of the library at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. It's been accessed now by quite a few researchers from around the world, and it's not very hard to gain access to it. There are videos there. There are the photographs. Anybody can look at them.
And I suppose for historical purposes, it's useful to note that in the late 60s, I guess about 1967 or so, Eisenbud wrote a book, The World of Ted Serios, that laid it all out in great detail.
He laid it all out in great detail in that book. It's a fabulous book. He came out in 1989 with a second edition, which is different in many respects from the first edition, not least of which because it includes responses to criticisms of the first edition. So for students of the case, it's really mandatory that you purchase both.
Well, the ones that impress me the most are instances where Ted Serios was asked to concentrate on an image that was hidden from him inside of an opaque envelope, typically sealed inside of an envelope and sealed inside of aluminum foil in that envelope, and he was able to produce thoughtographs that resembled those hidden images.
Let's not overestimate the closeness of the resemblance. They weren't that great, they weren't that close. Sometimes they were a little bit close. Sometimes what Serios got instead, according to Eisenbud, being the psychoanalyst he was, he thought that they showed more about what was going on in Ted's unconscious.
How the subconscious mind would modify the actual target.
Yes. Sometimes based on mispronunciations of words that had to do with the original target and so on. So it's really interesting to read Eisenbud's analysis of all this.
The distortions are particularly interesting. One of the things I think the distortions say is that it would be hard to fake those.
That's what's particularly interesting about the distortions. There's a picture, for example, of Eisenbud's ranch, which Serios produced. And what's interesting about it is that Serios' image of the ranch house, of the barn in particular, showed the whole area in a condition in which it had never existed, and in other respects in a condition in which it existed before Ted had ever seen the ranch. And Eisenbud published a copy of a contemporary picture of the ranch and barn, and Serios's, so you can look at them side by side.
In other words, the thoughtograph produced by Serios contained possibly an example of retrocognition, looking back into the past?
I don't know if it was just accident. Well, the problem there is that it also portrayed the ranch in a condition in which it had never existed.
Well, and in addition to that, some imagination mixed with retrocognition is what it sounds like.
It could all have been coincidence. I don't know. But another example would be the picture of the livery stable across the street from the Central City Opera House in Colorado. There, the original makes it clear that the outside of the building was a certain kind of brickwork, whereas in Serios' photo it looks like a kind of pressed stone or concrete. The windows in Serios' image of the livery stable showed the windows to be elongated, much more so than they were in fact. It also shows them apparently bricked in, which they had never been. It also shows a kind of playbill to the left of the door, which Eisenbud could never find, and certainly wasn't there when Eisenbud saw it.
Yeah. Well, it seems to me that the Serios case is very interesting also from a sociological point of view, because one might think that hundreds of psychically produced photographs, or thoughtographs, as they're called, would be clear-cut evidence of a phenomenon of great importance to science, and yet the opposition was so strong to that possibility that Eisenbud's research and all of that work on Ted Serios is almost forgotten today.
Well, one of the reasons it's forgotten, and here we have to talk about the elephant in the room, has to do with the contention that Serios used something called a gizmo, which was really just a rolled up piece of black paper that came in packs of Polaroid film.
Yeah.
Serios had gotten into the habit many years earlier of taking that, rolling it up, and he used it as a device to help concentrate, or if you'll pardon the expression, to focus on the task at hand.
He might like hold it up to his forehead.
He could hold it to his forehead, he could hold it up to the camera lens, and in, I think it was October of 1967, a couple authors published an article in Popular Photography magazine, which they claimed that Serios had cheated by placing transparencies in the gizmo, holding it up to the lens, and so what the thoughtographs were showing was the transparency in the gizmo. It's an incredibly lame explanation for reasons we can go into, and very few people knew that Eisenbud had issued a challenge in the subsequent issue of Popular Photography for anybody to try reproducing the photographs under conditions in which Serios succeeded, and nobody ever took him up on that. Now, what's interesting is that James the Amazing Randi claimed to have done just that. It's false, and we can talk about that. And to make matters worse, other people started repeating Randi's claim that he could do this.
Yeah.
And the science author Martin Gardner even claimed in the periodical Nature that Randy does it regularly and with more skill. It's complete falsehood, and it's what people took to be the truth.
Yeah. Now, I have seen Randy do that sort of thing in a completely uncontrolled occasion when he's up on stage. And
you saw him do the Thoughtograph?
Yeah.
Well, he failed on the Today Show, which is interesting.
Okay. And at least I saw him appear to do it. I'm not even sure what he really did, but it was in front of a symposium where he said, yes, I can demonstrate it. And this was decades ago. My memory is very hazy. But in any case, there are many reasons why that, even though that explanation was sort of gobbled up by people for whom thoughtography is unacceptable, there are many reasons why that explanation doesn't hold up.
Well, for one thing, and this is why blackies and whiteys are important, it doesn't explain how Serios could have produced blackies and whiteys.
Yeah.
Secondly, Serios was often separated, sometimes at great distances, as much as 60 feet from the camera. And he would have had to have held the gizmo right up against the camera lens. Thirdly, or whatever, I forget what number we're on.
We're on 3.
Serios was sometimes clothed in clothing provided by the experimenters.
And strip search.
Strip search, full cavity search. He was separated from the gizmo. He was separated from the camera.
The gizmo was itself examined?
The gizmo was examined. In fact, one researcher even put a string through the gizmo. He tied the string in a loop, which he kept around his neck, so that if Serios wanted the gizmo, the researcher would have to be pulled right up next to Serios. So he could clearly see what was going on. Sometimes Serios would produce as many as 50 or 60 thoughtographs in one session. So if he was using a gizmo in each of those occasions and a transparency in the gizmo, that means there were a lot of times in which he was surreptitiously coming up with an image from who knows where, placing it in the gizmo. And not only that, the only way that could possibly have worked would be if Serios was right up against the camera with the gizmo. If he's only a slight distance away from the camera, what the camera would take a picture of would be the gizmo, not the transparency.
Itself, yeah.
Right.
But the pictures that were produced were, as some that we've already shown, and some of them are hazy, but they have quite a bit of detail in them.
Quite a bit of detail, and no image of the gizmo whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, the striking thing is that Serios kept this up for years.
Yes.
I know that Eisenbud invited many members of the Denver scientific community to witness these events, so they were well witnessed.
Yes.
But people with that talent are extremely rare, it would seem. We haven't had a subsequent person come forward to produce thoughtographs.
Nothing like mini Serios is like mini Gellers.
Yeah.
No. And who knows if Polaroid photography becomes popular again, if instant photography becomes popular again, maybe they'll appear. There are other people who produce various kinds of photographs. There's a Dutch man named Robert van der Broek who does this. I don't know that much about the case, so I'm not prepared to talk about that.
Well, Eisenbud approached it as a psychoanalyst.
Yes.
He wrote a wonderful book on parapsychology and the unconscious.
Right.
It's a classic, one of the best.
And science psychoanalysis.
So he had a real interest in the unconscious dynamics that affect people with psychic gifts.
Yes, he thought that the manifestation of psychic gifts revealed a lot about the psychopathology of everyday life. And so he was always on the lookout for that kind of thing. And I don't think that anyone else in the field has probed quite as deeply as Jule did into why the phenomena take the forms that they do.
And yet Serios himself was not a highly articulate, cerebral person who could provide detailed explanations from his own mind about how he was operating.
No, he was more interested in getting drunk and going out and getting into fights.
Yeah.
Or picking up girls.
Picking up girls, yeah. So what kind of conclusions did Eisenbud arrive at?
Well, first of all, that the phenomena were certainly genuine,
Yeah.
that they were among the strongest and cleanest evidence we have for macro PK or large-scale psychokinesis, and that a thorough analysis of the Serios photos would show something about the way Ted's unconscious worked on those particular occasions. It showed his particular preoccupations. Sometimes it showed his misunderstandings of what was going on. Sometimes it just revealed his defiance in the face of the controls being imposed on him.
Mm-hmm. But it's hard to be more specific than that, I guess.
No, Eisenbud was mostly interested in establishing the genuineness, the authenticity of the phenomena. Mm-hmm. And he took a lot of abuse for that.
Why do you suppose we haven't been able to follow up more on this case and on other similar cases?
Well, because there haven't been many other similar cases. And what frustrated following up on the Serios case was the fact that Eisenbud eventually was bludgeoned into obscurity, and Serios lost his most impressive abilities. When I worked with him quite a bit later, he was still able to get partial blackies and whiteys, anomalous overexposures or underexposures.
In the 1990s, wasn't it?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Those effects should not have happened under the conditions that prevailed, but those were informal experiments. We mostly hung around reminiscing about Eisenbud.
Mm-hmm. I understand in China there's been work with children who have shown some ability to influence photographic images.
I've heard that too. I know there are people who think that the orbs that appear in digital photos are not just specks of dust, but something more significant. But those manifestations, I think, are a whole lot less interesting than what Serios produced.
There's also been, as I recall, some research involving remote viewing of targets where photographic film is placed adjacent to these targets, and when the remote viewer seems to be accessing the targets, the film gets exposed, as if there's some energy associated with the remote viewing.
Well, that's very interesting. I don't know about that, but it would connect with an experiment done by Carlos Osis and Donna McCormick a number of years ago, where the psychic Alex Tanis was asked to view a target in another room. There was a strain gauge placed at the place where that could actually be viewed in real life, and the strain gauge showed some activity at those times when Tanos was supposedly correctly viewing the image in the target.
Mm-hmm. And another interesting line of investigation that I think is related has to do with the UFO field. Dr. Berthold Schwartz, for example, did a lot of investigation of a woman named Stella Lansing, who produced photographic images of UFOs, often a whole series of UFOs in like a clockwork formation, and nobody could see them when they were being photographed, as if they were being her mental impressions.
Well, this is the Pandora's box that cases like Serios opens for us, because if it's possible for Ted or somebody else to impress images on film, then who knows what the actual source of images and other kinds of anomalous photos might be. Those apparently showing UFOs might in fact be projections similar to those of Ted.
No reason to think not.
Well, we can't conclusively rule it out.
Especially in cases where witnesses who were present when the images were photographed saw nothing in the sky.
Yes, right. Quite right.
So it suggests that, many people report anomalous lights and things in their photographs. Today, if you were to get on the internet, you would find lots of people posting those images.
Yes, and sometimes all it shows is a lack of understanding of photography.
Yeah.
The various kinds of reflections that can occur in a lens, carelessness in the use of the camera, smudges on the lens, could be any number of things.
All sorts of things, and the properties of light and humidity. And
And that's why Ted's phenomena are so important, because the distortions that appeared in Ted's images, the blackies and the whiteys, can't be attributed to these kinds of environmental factors. They really seem to be clear projections of whatever was going on in Ted's head. And sometimes just clear misses. I know one of your favorite Serios photographs is an image of the Denver Hilton.
Yes.
And that was a case where Eisenbud held and triggered the camera, and Serios was aiming to produce a picture of the Chicago Hilton, which is back in his old stomping grounds in Chicago. And he said, damn it, I missed. And what they got was this picture from a very peculiar angle that nobody really could have attained himself of the Denver Hilton.
I'm very impressed by that, and I guess we can only hope that people viewing this interview might take an interest in this subject, and that other talented thoughttographers or thoughtography subjects like Ted Serios will emerge and make themselves available for research.
That would be great, and I can't recommend strongly enough that people study the Ted Serios Eisenbud material.
And, well, who knows? Maybe something along those lines will appear on video.
Could happen.
I mean, the possibilities are interesting.
Yes.
Now with all of this new technology.
Yes, that's right.
Well, Dr. Stephen Braude, thank you so much for sharing this half hour with me. It's been fascinating.
Thank you, Jeff.
And thank you for being with us.